Hi, this is Joseph.
Hi, this is Isaac.
Hi, Isaac.
It's a pleasure.
Welcome back to the Iron Rod podcast.
And to all those who stayed with us from 2 weeks ago,
Thank you so much. And this is the third episode of the Iron Rod podcast, and today we discuss Napoleon III.
And the title of this episode is, of course, Second Time a Farce.
Now, you may be wondering, how is there a second time a farce? Which will not make clear, but we will make abundantly clear indirectly over the course of the episode why it is called that way. But you may be wondering why it's second time a farce if it's Napoleon III. So Napoleon I wins all these grand campaigns. He loses at Battle of Waterloo. It's a traumatic experience, and now there's no longer a Napoleon I, master of Europe. What happens next? Now there's a Napoleon II. Is he important, and why are we not discussing him?
Well, he is not very important, as a matter of fact, because, when Napoleon I loses his throne, Napoleon II is a child. As a matter of fact, Tolstoy relates to us how Napoleon took with him to his famous campaign in Russia in 1812 a portrait of his child, also known as the King of Rome, playing something resembling baseball, some kind of a French game resembling baseball, and the soldiers were less than pleased with it, or less than impressed. Actually, no. According to that's Tolstoy, who is less impressed with it.
Tolstoy was less impressed. I remember this passage in War and Peace. Everybody should read War and Peace for the tremendous value of a novel, not as a military history.
And absolutely skip the historical analysis. It's garbage.
If you think you actually understand any military strategy, although he does a great job of conveying the fog of war, but he makes it sound like the fog of war is so impenetrable that a general or marshal has no idea how to control a battle, which is totally wrong.
He basically argues that the entire idea of strategy and tactics are superstitions.
Well, that is a very Russian approach, because they have no idea. This is why all the best Russian generals were all German.
Well, that's also why they don't really need an idea. They have one idea, which is to throw bodies at the enemy until he runs out of bullets. But
so Tolstoy actually has a joke in the novel that we finally found the Russian general to command the Russian army, because all their generals are often Germans from the Baltic or other places.
Apart from Bagration, who was actually Georgian. Not the last time that a Georgian leads Russians to ignominious defeat and gets praised for it in the homeland.
Looking at you, Stalin. So that's Napoleon I, and that's a connection with Napoleon II, his son,
who never actually becomes important, as a matter of fact.
This is his son by his second wife from Austria,
Marie-Louise.
And he doesn't become important, but it's interesting the link between the second and third and Napoleon II and Napoleon III, insofar as the entire continent of Europe has their eyes focused on Napoleon II after his famous father is first deposed and then dies in exile in St. Helena in 21. Everybody's focusing on Napoleon II. They're all terrified that there's an ogre about to be unleashed, but then nothing happens, and he's very much restrained, and everybody forgets about the possible upcoming.
Well, they just raise him as an Austrian nobleman of royal blood, give him a nice duchy, and he lived a nice quiet life. As a matter of fact, he became an Austrian military officer, and he would face his cousin Napoleon III in battle later in his life, fighting against France.
So that's interesting that in ages past, they probably would have killed someone like that because of the threat that he posed.
Oh, but this is 19th century Europe.
Time.
Sure. Civilized. Well, Austria is civilized. In France, the Restoration is less than civilized. Well,
what's somewhat more perplexing, though, and maybe you could comment on this, but maybe not a lot is known, is that he wasn't properly brainwashed. So he was a big fan of his actual father, Napoleon I, and not from his mother's side of the family, who was representing the Austrians, the enemy.
They didn't see any reason to brainwash him against his father. All they need to do is to brainwash him to be a good Austrian. Or as we call it, giving him a good education.
Yes, but fortunately for all concerned, or at least for the paranoid leaders of the European continent, he dies at a tender young age, I believe of pneumonia. And thus the Napoleon II, the son of the famous Napoleon, passes into history, and this is why we're not going to be talking about him. We're going to be going on to the famous Napoleon III. Now, how is he related to the famous Napoleon?
Actually, that's a disputed point. Because, okay, so let's start by the fact that Napoleon III is either not related at all to Napoleon I, or related to him more directly than he would like to admit.
Huh.
Okay, so let's start with Napoleon's first wife. It all started with Josephine. Josephine married a man before she ever met Napoleon. She was married to a man named whose last name was de Beauharnais. She was a Creole, by which I mean not she was half. No, I don't mean that she was of mixed ancestry, but I mean that used to be the term for every Frenchman living in the French colonies in the Western Hemisphere.
Interesting.
As a matter of fact, she came from the fair Isle of Saint Dominique, which of course fell to slave rebellion, but that was after she left with her husband. And her husband fell to a different kind of rebellion, to the French Revolution. He was executed because he was an aristocrat, and not the most safe occupation. As we discussed last time, during the French Revolution. But he leaves her 2 children, a son and a daughter. The son we can leave behind. He doesn't matter right now, or never really mattered. But the daughter is Beatrice, if I'm not mistaken.
And this is the daughter of Josephine.
Josephine,
who is Napoleon's first wife. So we mentioned in our previous episode that Napoleon, in fact, had left Josephine eventually and married this.
I'm very sorry. Her name
heiress.
is not Beatrice. Her name is Hortense.
Hortense, and this is Napoleon's first wife's daughter, so his stepdaughter.
His stepdaughter. And from the beginning, Hortense is she's a very beautiful girl, resembling her mother in the good points. And
did she have black teeth?
No, actually her teeth she has great teeth. Unlike her mother.
Yeah, I was going to say this was a slur or maybe a true thing they said about her,
yes.
Her mother.
But she resembled her mother not only in her looks, but also in her temperament. And by her temperament, I mean by her attitude to men. And by her attitude to men, I mean she likes them. By she likes them, I mean, yes, she is, okay, I won't use profanities on such a prestigious podcast, but let's say that she has a lot of relationship with men, starting, according to an old rumor, with Napoleon himself. She was sleeping with her stepfather, according to a persistent rumor. And,
oh my.
And or at least rumor has it that he feels to her more than he should, more than a good stepfather should towards his stepdaughter. And he marries her to his little brother, Louis. Now, Louis is a very interesting man.
He marries who? He marries who to who?
He marries off Hortense de Beauharnais, his stepdaughter, to Louis, his little brother.
Okay, so she's marrying her uncle.
His step uncle, yes. Yes, and the marriage doesn't go well. First, Louis, from the beginning, suspects something is going on between her and her stepfather, and besides, he doesn't need to. He also have more than a suspicion about basically every male figure that goes across Hortense in any given hour of the day.
And this suspicion may, in fact, be justified.
Very, very justified. As a matter of fact, and she hates him because various reasons. He was a quiet man. He was actually a very agreeable man in terms of his personality. Unfortunately, he had some skin malady that she thought was very revolting. But eventually, her stepfather makes him the king of the Netherlands, and
so Napoleon I makes his brother the king of the Netherlands.
It's not such an uncommon thing to do for him. He makes his older brother Joseph the king of Spain. Well, if we have any Dutch listeners, they would understand the joke that he probably that probably passed through a lot of people's mind, but the thing is, while Joseph Bonaparte was hated by the Spaniards, and the feeling was in all likelihood mutual, Louis Bonaparte is actually beloved on his new subject, and he loves them back. First of all, the Netherlands joined the French Revolution quite enthusiastically to begin with. They were the most easy to conquer people in all of Europe for the French revolutionaries. They were under the yoke of France, of the French Revolution, almost from the beginning. They call it under the Batavian Republic. So they basically go hand in hand with everything France does, and France becomes an empire, so they become a monarchy, a revolutionary monarchy. And very soon, Louis invoked the ire of his older brother, because he won't press his new subjects, the Dutch, for more taxes and men for Napoleon's war machine. But as a matter of fact, one of Napoleon's famous letters to him was him rebuking him of treating his subjects the way he should have treated his wife, and treating his wife the way he should have treated his subject. Namely, he was fighting with his wife, but agreeing to everything his subjects advised him.
Interesting. And this, I believe, itself was initially seen by his wife as a sort of punishment, because she had to be removed from the very charming court in Paris.
Oh, she hates the Netherlands. She hates Antwerp. She hates Amsterdam. She hates Rotterdam. She hates The Hague. And most of all, she hates her husband. And
eventually they have such a big palace they almost never see each other.
Oh yes, at a certain point, she go in 1806 to a nice vacation in the Pyrenees with quite a big retinue, as is expected from the Queen of the Netherlands and the wife of the Emperor of the French, and she gets pregnant. And her husband was not on this trip, so she zips through back home to her husband, who at the time is in Italy, I believe, and she's all hugs and kisses, and you know what else follows. And lo and behold, 8 months later, there's a healthy baby boy, which Louis, who at the beginning thought that his marriage finally healed and finally managed to come through to the cold heart of his terrible wife, understand that he was cuckolded. I'm sorry, I have to use this word. There's no other word.
So this was a persistent rumor at the time until today, and you are saying that this is in fact the veracity of the matter.
Yes, that's the rumor, that's the scandal, and as a matter of fact, Louis Bonaparte doubts to the last day of his last day if Napoleon III is actually his son. Yes, Napoleon III, by the way, is the baby. Is the baby. He already has an older brother, probably also not by Louis Bonaparte. Now, we know that she met Napoleon I on this trip to the Pyrenees, because Napoleon I, of course, was on his way to Spain on campaign. But also she had a very large retinue with a lot of charming men. So
in all likelihood it was one of these charming men, but the possibility exists that it was actually Napoleon I.
Yes.
Her stepfather.
So if anything, Napoleon III's claim might be either completely bogus or even better than he claimed.
Yes, it's one of those instances where you don't want to necessarily be proven right.
Yes.
I believe they've taken DNA in recent times, and they've come up with some conclusions about this. Though I'm not sure how conclusive it is.
Really? What do you know about it?
I've heard conflicting things, but that's what happens when you read Wikipedia. So I'm not going to comment further, but I do recall reading that they did prove it with DNA that they were actually related. But who knows?
But of course,
maybe if it was in fact Napoleon, then it wouldn't.
But hey, she was not above sleeping with the other brothers. I'm just saying. Well, we bash Hortense quite a lot, and we'll bash her quite a lot once more, because the way she chose to raise her boys. I blame her for everything wrong that happens in Europe for the next 70 years.
Speaking of which, as a segue for our next segment, Isaac will speak about some of the tyrannical things of Napoleon III, who, by the virtue of the fact we're even giving him that appellation and we're discussing him, that should be an indication that he becomes ultimate monarch. And I will, in fact, maybe bring up some of the positive things, or seemingly positive things, that he did. So when you say that she's responsible for all the terrible things he did, well, then she'd ipso facto also responsible for the amazing things. And I'll leave it off with one tantalizing detail. Paris is called the City of Lights. Why is it called that? You could thank Napoleon III. We'll see you on the other side.
Let tyrants shake their iron rod, and slavery clank her galling chain. We fear them not, we trust in God. New England's God forever reign.
Joseph and Isa back for our next segment. On episode 3 of our Iron Rod podcast, we are discussing Napoleon III. And before we discuss him again, which we talked about his upbringing, we talked about his birth, more than is often necessary because of the important complexities, let's talk a little bit about the period. So we mentioned in June of 1815, Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo, and then France changes dramatically for the future up until today. When they speak about France being under a certain number republic or a certain empire, this is all culminating from events that took place after Waterloo. After Waterloo, on the long coattails of the invading armies, the Allied armies, the British, the Germans, and the Prussians, and so on, they bring back the king. Their Bourbons are restored to the throne, and they're there from, again, after Waterloo, from 1815 to 1830. They bring back various symbols and elements that were associated with the historic monarchy, one of which, for example, is having the capital punishment, executing people for religious crimes, which had been previously eliminated, naturally. Eventually, there is a revolution, and this is replaced by July monarchy. I'm going to briefly discuss some of these things. Isaac will add some more color. July monarchy is still the monarchy, but is now, I believe, the cousin of the king.
Remember in our last episode we mentioned the Duke of Orleans, who signed off the who voted to execute his cousin, King Louis the King Louis XVI.
So this is his son who
yes,
kind of,
and his son says, "Oh no! I am the son. I am a son of the revolution. We, the Orleans, we are for the revolution, but we are for the good revolution, not the bad revolution that got hijacked by the Jacobins. No, I am the last of the Girondins. You want peace, you want prosperity, you want liberty, fraternity, equality? I am your man. I will keep France. I'll keep the France of the revolution,
the ideals
of the revolution, and the traditions of the monarchy in check. As a matter of fact, he goes so far that in 1838 he actually brings about the restoration of the remains of Napoleon I to l'Hôpital des Invalides, which in Paris, of course, which of course brings us to some very, very ridiculous part of our story, but let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yes, so, and although in his mind and some of the bourgeoisie, perhaps this was going on, for some people you were simply replacing the Bourbons with
the Orleans.
One set of kings and another. And this is why, till today, there are still two pretenders to the throne. From the monarchical side, as opposed to the Napoleonic side, you have, I think, the Bourbon pretender and the Orleans. Am I correct in that?
That's correct, but actually from the Bourbon side, you have two, because one of them is a Spaniard, and some of hardcore legitimists claim that a Spaniard cannot be the King of France. The King of France must be French. Damn it.
And what is interesting about the connection with the French is that at this point in time, when he takes over in what we call the July monarchy, instead of being called the King of France, he's trying to, live up to the ideals. He's being called the King of the French.
Oh yeah, he also channeling Napoleon I here, obviously.
So yeah, and channeling also that he's able to make lemonade out of lemon. So I don't think necessarily he instigated the riots in the street that undid his predecessor, but when those took place, he comes in, takes advantage, and becomes monarch.
Well, the Orleans are the family of opportunity. They have been so since the days of his great grandfather Gaston de Orleans, who of course tried to overthrow Louis XIV as a child. I believe we discussed. I think we discussed him. No.
I think we briefly discussed that, but I think it goes back even.
Yeah, the thing is the Orleans, the family de Orleans comes from the junior branch of the royal family. The Dukes de Orleans was always a title that handled to the king's little brother, and of course the king's little brother always hopes that the king, his older brother, will die heirless, and then of course he will become the heir. So of course it's
a story as old as time.
Yes.
So, but in this case, as in other cases, he actually gets the monarch, and things are pretty well until something happens in 1848, and there are revolutions and riots all over Europe.
And in Paris in particular. And I say Paris because France as a whole is pretty quiet. Paris is the sore boil that keeps bubbling up and exploding.
Yes, and now I think we could segue a bit into some of the Napoleon III's activities. So during this time, he hadn't been completely idle. Tell us a little bit about his life, specifically two of his coup attempts.
Well, the thing that's most interesting is that both of his coup attempts were against Louis Philippe, the king, the Orleanist king, not against the two Bourbon kings. Yes, Louis XVIII and Charles X. Why is that? Well, we need to go look back at the way what the Bourbons actually did when they came back to power. So when Napoleon fell the first time in 1814, the Bourbons came back and they were all smiles and love and rainbows. Remember, Louis XVIII spent the last approximate 20 years being the bugbear of everybody in France, who was told that if the Bourbons ever come back, there will be slaughter, there will be blood, and this time it will be the people's blood. Not those are and
surprisingly, he comes back and nothing happens.
Surprisingly, he comes back and he issues a constitution, and in the constitution he says, "I forgive and forget all that happened, all the unhappy things that happened. I banish them from my memory." Now, everybody who ever been in a relationship knows if your significant other said, "I forgive and forget," they don't forgive and they don't forget. Now, in this case, he actually gives France a constitution that's not that different. It actually creates a legislature, a bicameral legislature, in which, surprise, surprise, actually had some power. The king actually has to consult his legislature on something. Yes, the king holds tremendous amount of power, but the legislature actually have something to do. Unlike the Napoleonic constitution, as we discussed last time, it's full of a lot of dead ends and vestigial things that don't lead anywhere.
Are you saying that the Bourbon constitution, I think called charter, is in fact less of a dead letter than the Napoleonic?
Absolutely, because the Bourbons know that they have to actually appease the people of France. They have something to prove. They have to prove that they are not that bad.
But then something happens with the 4 statues. Or are you getting to that?
Oh yeah, I'm getting to this. So after Napoleon comes back to power and falls after the 100 days, the Bourbons comes back with, as you said, on the coattails of the conquering armies, and they are not amused. They are not amused at all. And that started what we call the White Terror, which basically was brought up. It was instigated by what we call the 4 statutes of Louis XVIII. Basically, it's a period in which people who were revolutionaries in their past were partly. It's a purge. It's a bloody purge that the Bourbons are conducting throughout France, and people are fleeing to other parts of Europe. They are fleeing to to England. They are fleeing to America, and and it's not pleasant to anybody involved. Now, even though later, the white terror subsides after a while, everybody remembers it. Everybody remembers it very well, and as far as the Bourbons is concerned, it's good that they remember it because now they know. Now they know, yes, we gave you the charter, we kept the meritocracy in the army, we kept the goddamn Code Napoleon, who secretly finished what our royal grandfather Louis XIV started by centralizing the legal system of France. But we let you keep all these things, but don't cross us, gentlemen. We are still king, by the grace of God. Thank you very much. And Charles X, who is less skillful than his father in yielding the dual swords of terror and feigned forgiveness, falls from power. As a matter of fact, he falls from power because he refused to bomb Paris when it's again in revolt. So the people of Paris elects Louis Philippe to be the Orleanist monarch, and he becomes and he's supported by the bourgeoisie, who of course under the new constitution, only a few people in France have the right to elect the lower house of the legislature. Those people are called the electors. They are not a government. They are not an elected body. We are not talking about the electoral college here. We are talking about the limited amount of people who are rich enough to be considered substantial enough voices in the community to have the vote. We're talking something approximately, I believe, between around 3 million ish in a country of, I think, 35 million, and so most Frenchmen don't have a vote, and it doesn't really matter because the government under Louis Philippe actually does reasonable job in making France happy, fat, prosperous, and quiet. And here comes our lovely subject, Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, son of who spent. By the way, Louis Napoleon, as we call him before he becomes emperor. Sorry about the spoiler. He is a child of divorce. His father, the former king of the Netherlands, decides that he had enough of his wife's very interesting shenanigans, and he separates from her. Now, he's a good Catholic, so he cannot properly divorce her, but he doesn't really. But they just separate. He lives in Italy. She lives in Germany. That's where she raises his son. He travels from time to time. Travels to his father in Italy, his alleged father, of course. The father is a bit cold.
Also spent some time in Switzerland, right?
Yeah, he spent some time in Switzerland. He goes to school in Augsburg, in the Rhineland, and that's why. By the way, that's one of the reasons that to the last of the day he spoke French in a slight German accent. So while his great uncle spoke French in a slight Italian accent and used Italian mannerisms and sayings, his favorite was finita la commedia, but he does the same. He have the same Germanic influence, but that's besides the point. And his mother doesn't really care that she's not technically divorced, and while she's feigning to be a devout Catholic herself, she has dalliances with men. She writes some terrible romantic poetry and some terrible romantic music.
So let me just say that for our loyal and dear listeners, no sacrifice is too great, and therefore I did not have to read any of the poetry, but Isaac did.
Oh yes. Yes, it's terrible. The most famous piece is Partant de la Syrie. Partant en la Syrie. I'm sorry, my friend.
I just want our audience to know what sort of things we do for them.
Yes, I know. It's a terrible. Oh God, I don't know what even to call it. Rhyme that she actually wrote even a music to. Very terrible music. Da 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 da. So something along those lines. Very schlocky
This is not
stuff.
our official recommendation in terms of music. And art.
Absolutely, nobody should listen to
We
it
do have an
ever.
official one that's also not positive in your estimation, but we will recommend that as befitting the time and the farce of Napoleon III. But
Yes.
we'll get to that later when we discuss that.
Absolutely. And so he grows up, and she pumps into him the idea that he was born to rule France. She's a very romantic woman. That's probably why she couldn't. I don't think she was a woman who was wayward. She was not, unlike her stepfather, who was just a man with a very big appetite. It's not about her sexual appetite. It's just that. Or, by the way, her son would be exactly like that, a man with a very big appetite, and not this kind of appetite. She, I believe, was just a romantic. She couldn't resist. She just couldn't resist certain men, and we know that all her men are very charming, very handsome in a very particular way, have very cultured. So it's a matter of someone who is too romantic for their own good. I would say
And
it
she
like this.
passes on that romanticism.
Well, the
her
problem
son.
is not exactly that she passes on the romanticism to her son. The thing is that romanticism lead her to raise her son by the romantic idea that he is supposed to redeem the the heritage of the legacy of the Bonapartes. He's supposed to lead them back to the throne and to rule France one day. It's something that's very clear to him, by the way. He says again and again and again and again. From time to time, men of destiny are born on the fate of nations on whom the fate of nation rests. I believe that I am such a man. He says it repeatedly over the years. By the way, that's one of our quotes of the day.
But that is a good quote for him. I mean, ironic, I think, coming from him.
And yes, I would say his life was very faithful to France. And so in 1836, he starts. First of all, by law, he's not allowed in France.
Awkward.
Very awkward, but it's a reasonable measure if you are the French government. And in 1836, he starts. Okay,
1836, who was in control of France at the time?
Louis Philippe, the citizen king, of the House of Orleans.
And what antic does he get after?
So let's start with he goes to Strasbourg with and he assembles some people over there, very interesting people. There's Madame La Gourdon, which was a French woman a French widow of a Scottish mercenary who fought in one of the civil wars in Spain. This lady is a very charming lady, very interesting lady. She shoots and fights and duels and rides like every other man of the 19th century and of the early 19th century, and she.
And she's one of his henchmen. So I imagine, I'm gathering from what you're saying that he assembles some sort of mercenary force. This is like a Hollywood movie of an eclectic band of different people, of different colors.
Very D&D, gentlemen, very D&D, but unfortunately real life is not D&D. It's not even a Walter Scott novel. So while he is marching on the garrison of Strasbourg, trying to convince the soldiers to come to his side, he actually bribed a few of the officers. The one loyal sergeant closed the gate of the fort behind him and separates him and his motley crew. By the way, he is wearing one of his uncle's old suits, which doesn't suit him because first he have a completely different figure. I believe he's a few inches or a whole feet taller, and the structure of his body is completely different. So Napoleon I had relatively long legs and a short body. He was a very handsome man before he gained weight.
Napoleon III is a beer of a man.
Yes, Napoleon III is a very big man, very lanky man, I would say, but his legs are relatively short to his torso, which is why he never really cut the romantic figure in person, and he's very phlegmatic. He's a terrible orator. So I remember when Napoleon the First talked to the soldiers in Italy. He told them things like, "I need men with balls," or "Soldiers, you are hungry, you are naked. Come with me, and I'll show you the richest booty in the world." Napoleon I knew how to speak like an emperor, but he also knew how to speak like how should I say it? Like a rascal, like a Corsican bandit when the opportunity called for it.
And they followed him to the gates of hell.
Oh, absolutely.
And vis-a-vis Napoleon III.
Napoleon III speaks like a pompous, bombastic, little preppy shit. I'm sorry. He speaks, and in a German accent.
I think you're portraying a comical scene.
Yes, and so imagine this guy in a uniform that's at the same time too short and too long for him. He clearly is not comfortable because it's too narrow and too wide in exactly the wrong places. He got separated from all his supporters by a very heavy iron gate. You can't see, but Yossi is laughing, and he's arrested, and everybody else is arrested behind him, and
this is coup attempt number 1.
That's coup attempt number 1. That's Strasbourg, and
not successful. I'm gathering.
Not very successful. And Louis Philippe see it with such amusement, such light-hearted. He viewed it as such a petty comic opera that he basically lets him go.
Let me add a slight a nuance to the comic opera, and that is that these sort of things are actually good for the current King of France, because the fear that there will be a Napoleonic coup or a coup from the other monarchies, other royalists, actually ensconces him more firmly on the throne.
Absolutely. And also, it actually calms him down. Well, if that's the best the Bonapartists can do, well, I don't need to worry about them, do I? So for the next few years, Napoleon and Napoleon after that is no longer welcome in the particular part of Germany in which he and his mother reside until now. So he moves to England. In England, he meets a lovely woman. Her name is Miss Henriette Howard. She is charming. She is cultured. She is well dressed. She's well versed in literature, in music, in everything. She is a whore. I'm sorry. No, I'm not insulting her. That's her actual profession. She's a high-end prostitute who actually falls in love with him. Imagine that.
I see.
And
does he fall in love with her?
Oh, well, hard to say. Well,
just with lovely bits.
Well, he.
And how long are they seeing each other?
Well, for quite a while, and as a matter of fact, she loves him so much. At that point, Napoleon III is a rich man because his father died and left him something around £3 million in cash, which is a very large sum. Somehow he goes through it in a year.
That's quite remarkable.
Yeah, and he lives.
So he's ironically being bankrolled by these people in England.
He's actually been bankrolled by his. Partially, people just give him credit because he's a rich man because he comes from a rich noble family, and by the logic of English merchants and bankers in the early 19th century, well, you cannot embarrass a gentleman with cutting his line of credit off, at least not within reasonable limit. So they let him dress on their behalf. If he buys they let him buy a nice suit. He'll pay later. He takes a loan from time to time. He pays later. He gambles. Okay, it's all in the tab. It's all in the house.
And all the while he's scheming for his next coup attempt.
Yes, and he is scheming with the help and actual financial aid of Miss Howard, the courtesan, and which he lives with.
The rich courtesan.
He's a very rich courtesan. He actually has 2 children by her.
Is that a fact?
And I know. Terrible. I mean, oh man, the man was a walking tabloid. And I'm sorry, I can't take him seriously. And 1840, and later, we mentioned how Louis Philippe feels that he has no threats from the Bonapartist quarter. So he decides, okay, my regime is kind of losing its luster. I don't need to really be worried about the Bonapartists because, come on, what would they do? Try Strasbourg again? So let me bring back Napoleon I. I'll show how much I admire the great emperor, and how now we are all Frenchmen, and yes, we disagree about a lot, but we're all Frenchmen. He was a French hero, etc., etc., etc. Now, here we come to something, to the second comic coup attempt, which is very funny. So, the coffin is supposed to travel from the island of Saint Helena to the south of France and through there to Paris. Now, Napoleon III hires a cruise ship, a small one, not a big one. You know, we think we must not be immodest. You know. He loads it with wine, with food, with weapons, with some riffraff, with some Italian, French, and Polish riffraff. He pick up off the streets. Some poor immigrants. When I say riffraff, it's just the term that everybody uses because we're talking about. We're talking.
These are not even professional mercenaries.
No. Those are just poor people. Some of them are street criminals. Some of them are just poor immigrants with nothing else to do. Some of them are not even aware of what he's planning. So, and he hires the cruise ship with the captain, who doesn't have an idea what's going on. And he goes to Boulogne. And in Boulogne, he waits there for some few co-conspirators in the military who promised him, the moon, that they would turn first their regiment and then the entire army in his favor, and everybody would everybody have the name of the great emperor on their lips, and they will carry him to Paris. No, it doesn't happen. It's really embarrassing. The most embarrassing part is that he trained a vulture, not even a proper eagle, to land on his hat when he raised it and eat from it. So the idea is when he do his progress through France, he would raise his hat. The vulture would
pretending to be an eagle.
Yes. Well, he planned to do it at night. At the early hours of the morning, nobody would notice. And besides, how many Frenchmen actually saw an eagle or a vulture in their life? And he would land, and everybody would, and all the common people, the simple, good, common people, fans. You notice what a condescending little shit he is, right? And he would come over and see, oh, there's an eagle landing on his hat, and it's Napoleon. Vive l'Empereur! Doesn't happen. As a matter of fact, he's getting arrested so quickly that they forgot to release the vulture.
Poor thing.
And this time, Louis Philippe is less forgiving, and he sends him to be tried by the upper house of the legislature, the House of Peers, and they send him to the fortress of Ham. And in the fortress of Ham, he enjoys quite good, very favorable conditions. He actually manages to have a liaison with the daughter of one of the wardens. He plays chess with the warden every evening, and he has 3 rooms for himself. He writes some interesting texts, very mediocre ones. Don't bother. One is about the life of Caesar. One is called Napoleonic Ideas, which is basically and one called on the abolition of poverty. And
this last one has almost Marxist overtones.
Oh yes, very socialist. I think he was trying to cozy himself up to the French left, and
although I believe it was very popular in the country of France.
Well, the idea basically was there was so much wasteland in France. Why won't we just settle all the poor people of Paris on this wasteland, basically internal colonization. The thing that he misunderstood, and he might have been influenced by his experience in the United States, because he was in the United States for a while, and
What was he doing in the United States? He was exiled to the US?
he was exiled to the United States. It was after the fiasco in Strasbourg. He had a stint in the United States.
Which is interesting that Napoleon the First, while he was in exile in Saint Helena, had various plots and conspiracies to free him from his exile and make him escape and become some sort of general or warlord or conquering hero. And one of the plots
America
was to bring him to America,
and then
he was worried he would get assassinated.
Yes, and the thing that he missed is, while in America expansion west, the Homesteaders Act, which later basically came to fruition, the Homesteaders Act, essentially Napoleon's idea, made sense in the United States when the western lands were not very seriously cultivated by modern means. Therefore, it's possible that there was a lot of fertile lands which just was there,
Easy to be exploited by these poor people moving in.
As
opposed to
France have been cultivated land since the late Bronze Age. If there is a place in France which is not used for agricultural cultivation, it's for a reason.
Yes. And speaking, as we wrap up the second segment of our third episode on Napoleon III, speaking of cultivation, I hope to mention in the next segment about Napoleon III's grand project with agriculture. But we will see you on the other side. This is Joseph and Isaac.
See you later.
Hi, this is Joseph and Isaac. We are in the third episode of the Iron Rod podcast, where we discuss liberty and tyranny, philosophy of history, and today we're discussing Napoleon III. He was Napoleon I, the Great One's nephew.
Possibly son.
And the reason why he's significant as a third is because of what we're going to discuss now. He becomes the Emperor of the French. This is the last time the French have a king or an empire, or an emperor, except the Gaul, of course, who probably fancied himself in his imagination. But this is the last official time. My host is about to defenster me like 30 Years War style here. For anyone who's listening to our podcast, by the way, we have great fun, and it is really a humiliation that you can't see us in the act, but this is an audio medium only. So Napoleon III is the topic of conversation. He gets in via legal means as president, but he also has a coup. And he is emperor for a long time, longer, in fact, than his famous uncle. And let me just say the end of the movie before I turn it over, to just spoil it. He does various things as France, but the most significant and influential thing that he does is fight the Franco-Prussian War, or as it used to be called, perhaps better, the Franco-German War. And this is a war between France and the German states, eventually Germany, in which France loses in a humiliating fashion. It is perhaps the most significant thing to happen in Europe, therefore in the world, from the fall of Napoleon in 1815 until World War I. And it directly leads to World War I and therefore to World War II. So it's impossible to overstate the importance of this event. It kind of bestrides the 19th century like a colossus. And Napoleon III is dead center, literally dead center, surrounded by Germans in a city where he's captured and he has to surrender a sword.
Idiot. As a matter of fact, the last thing that he took care of it personally before the siege closed on him was to make sure that he have ample wax for his mustache. If you can see, if you have a picture of him, in a certain picture you can see that he liked to wear his mustache in a very Do you know those old-fashioned villains in movies, with the ones with the twirly mustache, with the very thin mustache that stands like a very thin like the thin black line?
I think you're accusing him of being an old-fashioned villain.
Well, I think that old-fashioned villains were basically inspired by him. But the thing is that does not occur naturally. That needs to be done with wax. And that's the last thing he took care of personally before the siege closed on him.
Yes. And how do we get to this? This is like in those movies, freeze frame. How did I end up in this position?
Yes.
By his presidency and by his coup.
Let's start with how France comes to have presidents. So in 1848, there's some famine in France. Now France is starting to industrialize, but it's still largely an agricultural economy. And a bad year means famine. It means people are suffering in the countryside and in the city. And worst of all, the stock market collapses. And now that might look like an insignificant thing, but consider the electorate of France is made up solely and exclusively of the super rich.
The people
Now,
that would have an interest in the stock.
as a matter of fact, Louis-Philippe often describes his regime as himself being the chairman of the board of the Corporation of France. So the corporation doesn't do very well, does it? So everybody wants to get rid of the chairman, and of course, the people are just hungry. The rich are worried, are both unhappy because the performance of the economy, the performance of the stocks, and also they are worried what the people would do in their anger. So a republic is being declared. There's universal suffrage. There's and the National Assembly assembles again, and at the beginning they handle all executive power to a man named General de Cavaignac. General de Cavaignac is a good old-fashioned conservative. He suppressed some of the most extreme element to the left, and he apart from that he respects the new laws and constitution of the republic, and then time comes to elect a president. Now Louis Napoleon at that part was put himself as a candidate to the National Assembly twice in absentia, because remember there is still a law that forbids him from coming back to France. But eventually they elect him to the National Assembly. He never attends because it's still this little legal difficulty. But then the new constitution says that there is a new office of the president. Now, who would become the new president of the French Republic? Napoleon III puts himself forward because the left in France is very angry at Cavaignac because of the way he prevents them from setting up another proper French Revolution like the last time. And the right is divided. Some of them are royalists who are not really. Some of them are legitimists, proper Bourbon legitimists who boycott the elections altogether. Some of them are Bonapartists, so they are at any rate on the side of Napoleon III and some of them are Orleanists who are divided who to support, Cavaignac or Napoleon. Now, because Napoleon knows how to make all the right noises to everyone. To the left, he shows himself to be a man of humanistic socialist leaning. He points to his pamphlet about abolishing poverty. Thank you, and probably also cancer and sadness. And to the right, he says, "Well, I am the nephew of Napoleon. I believe in the glory and grandeur of France." And to the few right-wing Republicans who actually believe in the Republic, he says, do not worry about me. Do not. I wish to return as a president, not as an emperor. No, by the life of me. As a matter of fact, when he takes his oath of office, he adds at the end of it a line of his own. I shall regard as personal enemy everyone who shall attempt to change that France has established.
Could we use that as our quote?
Yes.
And it does seem, despite this man's demerits, that he is the ultimate politician, even in a way that his uncle was not, and that he could be all men to all people.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, when we discussed I believe that in the first episode we discussed how all the 20th century dictators were amateurs who merely tried to imitate Napoleon I. Now, the person they ended up imitating was not Napoleon I, but Napoleon III, because Napoleon I's propaganda was very classic. By classic, I mean it was he based his ways of establishing his power on Julius Caesar and other ancient rulers and other ancient emperors and rulers and dictators and tyrants. He gave people work through grand public works. He gave good speeches. He wrote well. He was a
So that is what's meant by classic.
But he never wrote an actual tractate in which he puts on his ideology, his idea how one should how he attempts to rule the state. He just ruled France.
So in a sense, he doesn't need to write such a tractate.
Of course, he himself, but Napoleon III, as we discussed, actually put forth a tractate called Napoleonic Ideas, in which he sets forth what he thinks should be done. And of course, he does a lot of blathering and dancing around and eating his cake and having it, but to appeal to both sides. And but basically, you can point out that this is the precursor to Mein Kampf, even though it's less hateful. And much less hateful. I don't think Napoleon III actually hated anyone. I don't think he had enough personality for it. And
he was just overflowing with oozy goodness.
Yes, exactly.
And what else is this possibly influencing in this sort of modernized propaganda?
He actually sets up a proper department of propaganda. He doesn't call it that, but he puts in charge a man named Persigny, a very romantic admirer of the First Empire, who actually is the instigator between the first two coup attempts. So he's not very good at actually planning coups, but he's good at propaganda. He have a panache, if you sense, for grandstanding and some great gestures. And
perhaps the great farce of Napoleon III is that the inability to translate success in politicking and success in propaganda to the martial success that his uncle was famous for.
His uncle did not need to be successful in politicking. He didn't need success in propaganda. His victories spoke for themselves. Until they didn't, of course.
Yes, but when you have victories, you make a few adjustments, that Napoleon shot personally directed the artillery to blow up the frozen ice ponds where all the Russians died, which he did, but then maybe only a few hundred Russian soldiers were killed. Maybe he turned it to a few thousand. I think this was at Friedland and so on. Or that Marengo, which he won, turned it into more. Yeah, I was always planning all along to almost lose the battle and then win at the last moment,
yes.
Which he wasn't. But he's turning actual success and he's embellishing it.
Yeah, it's a very Napoleonic thing to do.
I think the tragedy, and it's a farce and a tragedy of Napoleon III, is that he's pure propaganda. He is purely of whole cloth. He doesn't have the actual metal. His coup attempts are not even close.
Yes, apart from the last one.
His wars.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us about the last coup, the one that actually works. But this is already after he controls almost all the machinery of the state.
For a very long time, he's a president for 1848 to 1852. In 1852, he's supposed to step down. By the new constitution, he's supposed to step down and let the electors choose the new president, and it's the 2nd of December.
Because of the significant thing that you can only be president for one term.
Yes, because in that single term, he's very powerful. The French have a panache for strong heads of state. They like the idea. So while here in America, a lot of people are grumbling and scandalized, that almost all legislature is actually pre-written by the White House, in France, it's in the Constitution. All legislation have to start in the Council of State, which is elected by the National Assembly and pre-approved by the president before it even comes to the legislature, to the National Assembly. And he have a very large budget for his personal expenses. Remember how he spent £3 million in a year? Yes, that's so he has a lot of expenses, and the National Assembly is very obliging in giving him more and more money. But he spends in a very interesting way. He visits the Paris garrison and garrisons around France in general a lot. And every time he visits them, he gives wine and sausages to the men, and he gives champagne and a steak dinner to the junior officers. The senior officers, of course, they dine with the president, and it's a nice shebang.
Throughout this entire period, he is wooing the people of France generally, but specifically the military, and he's stacking the various departments and agencies with his men.
Exactly.
His loyalists.
And one particular case is the General d'Arnaud. General d'Arnaud was a brigadier general who did quite well for himself in North Africa. He was a right winger, but so he had no particular love for the Republic. But he also was an ambitious man. He was not particularly a Bonapartist by inclination, because that was for silly romantic. He was just an ambitious man. And of course, what does every brigadier general wants to be? A major general. And what does every major general in France wants to be? A marshal. Now, marshals didn't exist in France since the fall of the monarchy, but put a pin on it. So the problem is, and Napoleon understands that this is his man. This is the man that will help him become what he wants to become, and he wants to promote him to make him the Minister of War. There's only one problem: there are a lot of people who are more senior than him who would be very offended. And then there's a rebellion in North Africa, which he seized upon the opportunity. He sent Brigadier General d'Arnaud into there. D'Arnaud is a very skilled commander, and he managed to do it. And now he has an excuse to make him a Major General and the Minister of War.
And thus set himself up for success later.
Yes. At the 2nd of December, he declares a curfew in the city of Paris. The city of Paris does not take kindly to it. He actually worries, and the army deploys, but the people erecting barricades. Victor Hugo, in his famous pamphlet Napoleon the Little, or Napoleon le Petit, actually have a very interesting account of it. A lot of people that even supported Napoleon III in his attempt to re-election. I was wrong before. He can run for re-election, but he actually I was wrong.
I suggested that.
Yes, I'm very sorry about that. He actually lost, or at least we are not sure if he lost or he didn't lose. But he
didn't stick around for the results.
Yes, exactly. So a lot of people even supported him in his re-election bid when they saw what he during the coup stood with the Republic, because he was elected. When he was elected, he promised that he would be a good Republican president. And he clearly did not intend to stand by his word. So
he has a curfew. He has troops in the streets.
Troops in the street, and then the people are starting to riot, starting to curse, starting to march on the Tuileries when he resides, and he according to accounts, he stood there very pensive with his head on his hands. And he said, and his feet are against the fire, because he had a propensity to getting cold ever since his imprisonment in the very unhealthy fortress of Ham. And eventually he says, do what is necessary, and that's all Major General d'Arnaud and his co-conspirators need. The army slaughters people. it's a very sad thing. We said this is a farce, but it's a very bloody one. It's the kind in which the stage is very slippery and at the end, and many people die. We will never know how many. A board of inquiry is set afterwards to find out the names and the number of all the people who died, but we will never know because the board of inquiry was, of course, is of course selected by Napoleon III and his government, and of course is trying to clean himself as much of the blood as possible. But he is now president. He disassembled the National Assembly, which according to the Constitution is if the president attempts to do it, he automatically loses his office and becomes an outlaw. But when you have the army, who cares about the Constitution? And when you have that is when we have an army who is willing to shoot people in the street. And there is an attempt on the countryside. Not only is the city of Paris not on the inside, the countryside is also not on the inside. The peasants are revolting. It also puts down very quickly by the army, in a very bloody manner, and he becomes he declares himself president again. At this point, people are starting calling him the Prince President and addressing him as Monseigneur, which is the way to address royalty, not a citizen, who of course would be addressed as Monsieur, and eventually in 1952 eventually in 1852. So sorry about that. He passed the question in the referendum if to make him emperor, and it comes out positive, of course, because he just killed a lot of people to become president. Do you really want to stand between him and the imperial crown? And he become president, and the Second Republic dies an ignoble death after a very short, brutish and nasty existence. And this is the end of the story of the Republic. We'll see you on the other side.
Thank you. Hi, this is Joseph. I'm here with Isaac. We are doing the fourth segment of episode 3 of the Iron Rod. We're discussing Napoleon III. We have now gotten to the part where he's now Emperor of France. Indisputed. He has the army on his side. He just won an election. He's in a good place. Eventually, he is no longer in that good place. He rules until he's defeated in a war somewhat of his own choosing. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, which is famous for Bismarck creating and consolidating the various German states into the German state at the expense of the French regime, which falls with the surrender of their main army and of their emperor. Eventually that war drags on, though, for longer, and Paris is taken after a brutal and very famous siege and more changes of government. But that will be a story for another time, perhaps when we discuss another tyrant with another mustache, the famous Bismarck.
Yeah, you thought it was the other mustachioed German tyrant, didn't you?
Yes. Bismarck and him both have something in common at this time. They're arch rivals. They both were pretty ill.
Yeah.
Although Napoleon III was constrained by his illness to the extent that he could no longer operate. Bismarck used it as a negotiating tactic every time he wanted to stop negotiating, and he was a diplomat. All his life was about. He would say, "Oh, my stomach is hurting me," and he could leave the room.
Which is why, to those who make excuses for Napoleon III fumbling his last campaign, that's not an excuse. Also, for those making an excuse that he was not an experienced military commander, first of all, yes, that's why you should leave. You should have left it to the professionals. But second of all, that didn't stop Bismarck, did it? And
right, yes, he didn't have his equivalent of Moltke. And I think before you said that, we both said that he, didn't have strong enough character to hate anyone. He was such a lovable guy. Some of the good things he did was agricultural reform. France, after this, did not really have a famine, or a major famine, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
City of Lights, rebuilding Paris in his wisdom.
By the way, designing it so it will be impossible to erect barricades in Paris. At least it will be harder.
Clever. Well, listen, you got to prepare for every eventuality. His man put so many gas-powered lights. That's why it was called City of Lights. Unfortunately, the city was burned during the Civil War, during the Franco-Prussian War, which brought about the Civil War, but it was rebuilt along his lines. Also, I think women in universities, that was something that he did, and he expanded the franchise. And the Vietnam War, direct result. Obviously, the Vietnam War happened because the French, before America got involved, owned Vietnam.
And they owned Vietnam because he went to war in Vietnam, which actually went successfully.
So you could blame the Vietnam War on Napoleon III. You see, this guy gets around. We've already covered some of the things. We've already mentioned our quote of the day. Do you have a book for us that we could recommend to our audience?
First of all, the book of Napoleon III and His Carnival Empire by the wonderful historian John Bierman. He was a very interesting Canadian-British author. The book is very nice. It's actually, unfortunately, it's out of print. I managed to find it in New York in the Strand bookstore. That's your other recommendation that's a bonus recommendation. In New York. Please find them on Broadway. And so
good luck trying to find them. Maybe look online. That would be my first suggestion. We also have some music that the two co-hosts have a difference of opinion on. If it's abysmal or terribly abysmal. I actually think it's fine. It has a nice tune. But tell us about this. This you could get on YouTube for free.
So this is the little tune that I have lambasted so fiercely in an earlier segment of this episode. This is Partant pour la Syrie, or Living for Syria, that was written by his mother, Hortense de Beauharnais, and I believe it's a terrible song, and with a terrible music and terrible lyrics, and when the schlock is sickening, and it's and it happened to be the unofficial anthem of the Second French Empire. Yes. Enjoy.
But I don't think...
I'm sorry, I have to stop. I can't.
Yes, okay. We can't see eye and everything. I think that is a nice ditty. So check out that piece on YouTube. That is our recommendation. You use the word advisedly. We also have a movie recommendation.
Yes.
Not a very big. This is not very well known, a kind of a forgotten war, but not that much literature in the public imagination for an American today. But we do have. What is our movie recommendation?
Well, the first one is actually a fairly recent movie from 2016. It's called April and the Extraordinary World, in which Napoleon III is in the opening scene. He blows himself up. And as a result, and as a result, the House of Bonaparte is still on the throne of France because the Franco-Prussian War was avoided. Because of course, the only way to secure the success of a Bonapartist regime is to get rid of Louis Napoleon. I highly recommend this little French animation movie because it's for its really accurate historical analysis. Now, this is just an aside. An actual movie in which he actually plays a major part, because in the aforementioned movie, cartoon, he does not appear after the first scene. It's a 1936 movie called The Mad Empress. The Mad Empress in question is not his wife Eugenie, who was not mad. They just didn't get along after. Well, they didn't get along, and the marriage started falling apart after the wedding night. And the thing is, this movie is about his failed attempt to install an Austrian prince as the Emperor of Mexico during the American Civil War. Terrible idea, especially as he betrayed this emperor once things gets tough, and he and his other allies the other allies of the coalition essentially abandons him to his fate. The Prince Maximilian, or Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico, have no army of his own. He completely depends on his French and English allies, and when he's left, he's basically end up being executed by President Juarez of the Mexican Republic, and his wife he sent his wife at the last moment to plead with Napoleon III for help, but Empress Carlotta, when she arrives in Paris, she has a nervous breakdown and is incapable of pleading, of doing anything useful to anyone, and that's why her husband dies alone in a prison in a foreign land while she's suffering from a mental breakdown.
A sad story to a unsuccessful attempt, although an interesting demonstration, perhaps, of the famous Monroe Doctrine down south. America actually flexing its muscle and telling the Europeans, don't, we were a little distracted with the whole Civil War thing, but now that it's over,
don't push your luck.
Yeah, take your guy and go. So that is our actual movie recommendation. We covered some myths. The myth that we actually covered, that we substantiated, was that Napoleon III wasn't a product of his father, or of his mother's husband. But what are some other, do you want to have another myth? I have one up my sleeve, but something that you have in mind for his life or for that time?
I think his entire empire was one giant myth that needs to be busted. The idea that he was somehow resembling his uncle, he somewhat had grandeur or anything. No, he was a terrible. I said before, he didn't have enough passion or personality to hate anyone, but he was not above killing people because they stood in his way. He was a terrible, cold-blooded human being, or a very close simulacra of one. He was he led an empire, a corrupt, shambling empire that left France in shambles and in ruin, and he basically created our image of the French as all the bad stereotype of the French actually come from him and his failures. And it's funny for a man whose mother was a Saint Dominican, and his father, his alleged father, was Corsican, who spoke in a German accent to the last of his days, and who grew up in Germany and in Switzerland and spent most of his life outside of France. In short, that this man should give such a bad impression on the French people. It's tragic.
Well, I do think, and maybe we disagree on this, I do think that he is associated with the failure of France, specifically the calamity of the Franco-Prussian War in 1971. And because he's the Emperor of the French, all the blame must go to him. I don't think there is any sort of conceivable history where that doesn't happen. The Germans are eventually going to fight against France. This is the glue that will put all the little German states into Prussia's grasp. So Bismarck would have found a way to start it. And nobody else would have been able to fend off the Germans. And, even certainly not the National Assembly that rejected his desire to increase the National Guard, for example.
Yes, but don't underestimate Cavaignac. Cavaignac might have been able to do it, and that leads to the quote of the day. But Cavaignac, when he was arrested in the night of the coup of Napoleon III final coup, afterward he said, well, at least. And after the fall of Napoleon III, he said, well, at least it has been said of me that I descended from power, but didn't fall from it.
Definitely something to think about. And that is it for episode 3 of The Iron Rod. Hope you enjoyed that one.
A bit of ridicule, a bit of a farce, a bit of tragedy, a bit of sadness, but...
Should we drop a tantalizing hint as to what we will talk next time? Or you have to return anyway, no matter what? Because you know it will be interesting and you know that it will cover liberty and tyranny.
You already said it will be Bismarck.
No, speaking of which, I do want to mention that in the future we'll be talking about things that are tyrannical but aren't necessarily immediately associated. And by that I mean is we want to discuss, and my co-host has no idea I'm about to say this, the tyranny of two entities, Kronos and Zeus. So just to whet your appetite, that this show is about the history of philosophy, but we do cover a very broad array of things, and no one should suspect that we'll be pigeonholed in any fashion.
Absolutely. Absolutely not. That was wonderful.
And this is it for this week.
We'll be with you again next week.
And now remember,
Mort au tyran.